Hello and welcome to Green Queens, the perfect podcast for imperfect environmentalists, with your host, myself, Abbie Dewhurst, and Imogen Bogle.
Hello. Do you know what? I think that might have been the smoothest intro that we've ever done, because we've normally done I go, you go. We always have a little debate before who's going to do which bit. Perfect. I think from now on, maybe that's how we do it.
Maybe we just have to take it in turns per podcast episode and have our moment in the spotlight of the intro.
If you're watching this, you'll see that we're joined by a third person in this podcast, Olivia May. Olivia May has been on the podcast before, but also worth mentioning, and this is why she is in my house, she is my sister. We're looking at this. As we joined this call, I was like, our heads are really different sizes. We do not look related at all.
What do you think, Abbie?
So you look like you could be cousins. You definitely don't look like sisters.
Do you know, so we have a cousin called Lydia. You look like Lydia, or Lydia looks like you.
Or maybe she looks like the missing link.
I don't think she does. I look nothing like Lydia.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, you look like Lydia. I was adopted from a Spanish princess.
You look surprisingly like the postman, Imogen.
Exactly. We actually had a great postman. Do you remember him?
Well, Mum certainly thought so.
She did. Kooky lady. Anyway, those who will have heard the podcast with Olivia May before will know that you are a consultant, and specifically you look at the retail sector, which is great because it means that you have all the inside scoop on all manner of luxury brands. It also means that you're always wearing exceptional clothes. I've actually put in the request that anything you buy two, and then we could just wear the same, and that would be fine by me. But the reason that you're here today is that this is an update from the podcast we did last year. You have some new data specifically on the secondhand retail sector. Mm-hmm. And there are some fascinating insights into that. So that is the purpose of today. But I guess first things first, how are you doing?
Good, thanks. Yes, very happy to be here. Delighted to be a returning guest on your amazing podcast. And delighted to be chatting with you now.
Stop it. She's sweet.
She's so sweet. And I think we are so excited to do this update because the first podcast episode that we did with you was one of the first that we did full stop. It's also been one of our highest performing podcast episodes. So clearly, you talk the talk. Everybody's very interested to hear what you've got to say on this market. And I think personally, this for me has been like, if we're looking kind of 25 to 26, it's been the year that a lot of my friends that have always been a little reluctant, shall we say, to consider shopping secondhand. This seems to have been the 12-month window that those people have gone, oh, I'm actually going to go in this charity shop, or I'm actually, maybe it's because Never Fully Dressed have started doing their own secondhand section on their website, and all of a sudden that seems a little bit more appealing, or maybe they're diving into Vinted for the first time. But it feels like this shift has happened within my circle. And so I'm keen to know if that is something that you have actually seen happen in the proper world of retail.
We certainly have, yes. And we sort of had an 18-month elapsed time between the two programs of research that we did. And on the most recent one, we saw that the share of the UK population who are buying or selling secondhand online has gone up from about 30% to about 35%. And if you think about that in the context of both a pace of growth, but also an absolute proportion of the UK population who are now really engaging with resale, it's enormous. And I can totally empathize, Abbie, with, all those new adopters who have come in more recently and are suddenly like, wow. And they're coming at a time when the sector and the channels are really well developed. So they're then having a really great experience with it, which is hopefully going to keep them buying and selling secondhand.
And what's really interesting, because I think this was an insight from the podcast that we did with yourself last year, is that whilst Abbie and I would love for it to be true that the motivation for all these people is like, it's good for the planet, we should not be consuming fast fashion. What we know is that this is around convenience, the joy of finding those little gems, those passions, and the absolute joy of selling something on, for example, Vinted, and keeping that credit in your Vinted account. And I think that's the thing that certainly when I talk to my friends, they're like, oh, I found some Vinted. Oh, didn't even feel like I was spending money because I sold this other thing on Vinted. So I want to delve into some of those things specifically, but I think it's probably worth us just kind of setting the scene and understanding when we talk about the secondhand market, we're not just talking about Vinted. So within this sort of scope of research, what were some of the different types of format that kind of exist and that you were exploring?
Yeah, so we were looking at the entire resale landscape within fashion. So that is every possible channel or customer touch point you could interact with where you can get something pre-loved or end of life. So it's just anything that's not a first-hand transaction. So that does include all the peer-to-peer platforms, of which Vinted and eBay are the two major ones, followed by Depop. And they operate what we call kind of peer-to-peer models. So as a seller, I am selling directly to you as a buyer, but there is a platform in the middle that facilitates that transaction. Mm-hmm. We also looked at what we call classifieds models. That is where a platform makes a connection, but they don't always facilitate a transaction. So the best known one is Facebook Marketplace. We also looked at consignment models. So those are slightly different. That is where the platform themselves will buy the product from me and then sell on to you. And they'll take a cut of that transaction, and then also the seller will. So the Real is a very good example that falls into that category. And then the final model we looked at were the first-hand brands developing their own second-hand or buyback schemes. And those have slightly different guises depending on the model deployed. Sometimes the brands do those entirely themselves. Sometimes in the example like you gave, Abbie, of Never Fully Dressed, they'll partner with a tech platform or a white labeler to help facilitate that. And so what we were sizing and looking at and interrogating was that whole landscape.
God, and how has that landscape changed then since you last looked into that?
I mean, when we last discussed it, we talked a lot about the phenomenal growth that those channels to market have experienced, and that has not slowed down. And in many markets, it's actually slightly accelerated. So we are still in a world where secondhand resale in clothing is taking share of spend from first-hand retailers. And I would say, as you know, along with more and more people entering the secondhand market as buyers or sellers, the other big change we've seen over the last 12 months is that those first-hand brands now see this as major disruptive force to their industry, not a sideshow that I might need to have as a watch out. And so there's been a huge amount of attention paid to this, not just from you and I who love buying and selling on Vinted, but from the brands who see their products listed, and then the investors who want to try and get behind these sectors. So it's been a very busy place for us as a consulting firm, but it's beyond that. It's been a really, really disruptive year across the industry.
So just to pick up on one point there is that actually we're seeing growth in the secondhand market, but it is taking spend from the firsthand market. But there has been a net overall increase, from what I understand, in the overall volume of clothes that are being cycled through. So there is, on the one hand, it's like, oh, fantastic, we're like really accepting secondhand fashion as a part of our lives. But is it also encouraging us to cycle through clothes much more quickly, knowing that, you know, you could buy an item, still command quite a high price for it, and turn over your wardrobe much more frequently?
So yes, but there's a few sort of nuanced effects of how resale is impacting our interactions with our clothes, our sense of ownership over our clothes, and how we think about that in terms of a lifetime. So we're seeing consumers increasingly willing to opt into fewer, better garments. That sort of trend exists slightly outside of resale, but resale has been a really good accelerator and enabler of that, because I can buy into the same brand at a lower price point, or I can trade up to better quality. So you're seeing this trend towards fewer, better that's happening anyway. We're seeing consumers think a bit differently about ownership. And to your point, Imogen, that's definitely driving what we call higher liquidity in the market. So you are seeing that there is more turnover of garments transacted in any given year, but the proportion of those that are secondhand rather than firsthand is increasing. So where in the past you'd see that every year consumers would buy more and more stuff. And that was driving about 3% growth in volume in the fashion industry every year. We're still seeing 3% volume growth, but we're seeing 0% volume growth for first-hand transactions.
Interesting. And
I wonder also if people are seeing their wardrobes more transitionally, because it is easier to for stuff to, it's as easy as things to go out as it is for things to come in, and that hasn't been the case for so long. There's always been this gonna clear my wardrobe out, what do I do with it situation, so therefore I might just hang on to it. So it's like been a one-way transaction almost of add, and now it's a bit more in and out, and I guess that's maybe changed a little bit because of how much easier it is. But I'm really curious to know, so two things: do you think, or have you looked into, if these higher price point brands like, you know, let's say Omnes, I don't know if that's even how you pronounce it, but a cardigan that I'm wearing right now, quite a high price point but rather sustainable, high quality brand, but you go on Vinted and you can find a lot of their items at a much lower price, is that putting strain on the full price items, do you think? And are the brands aware of that? And also I'm intrigued to know if brands are worried. I feel like the reaction from brands is fear at the moment. Oh no, this is having a really negative impact, as opposed to seeing it as an opportunity to get ahead of the game and try and make the most of this amazing, like, continued earner from one garment. Like, two things, go.
And can I add one third little bullet point?
Of course.
So taking the beautiful cardigan that Abbie is wearing, and by the way, if you're just listening to this podcast, go over to YouTube and you can see aforementioned cardigan. But actually, does that mean that then brands are having to say, "Oh Christ, we're not transacting as many garments. We know that they're going to command a good price in the secondhand market. Therefore, can we charge a higher premium in the firsthand market?"
Yeah, good question. So I would say, in aggregate, the reaction from the first-hand retailers and brands that we interact with has shifted a bit from fear to, okay, what are we going to do about this?
Yeah.
And that's manifested in a few different ways. So there are a group of brands that are really leaning into resale. So they are actually seeing a high volume of listings on Vinted or eBay as a hallmark of quality and a hallmark of longevity and durability of that garment. So they're trying to lean into that. Let's give the resellers what they want. Let's give them garments that wash really well, that hold their shape, that don't lose buttons and trimmings, that really hold their value and are inherently resellable. And that, we hope, we could command maybe a bit of a premium for, or at least drive a bit of trade up from consumers because they know it's got that inherent resale value. And then the other wave of change that we're seeing is more and more examples of brands who are actively competing. So who are saying, actually, I can see tons of our stuff on Vinted. Why are we not trying to find ways to in-house that into our brand ecosystem and our direct touch points with our consumers? And there's a whole proliferation of B2B tech companies and partners that are helping them bring that to life in a way that's not completely profit dilutive for them. And the best examples here are now seeing that not as we have our first-hand channels and our second-hand channels, but we have a relationship with a customer and we are going to try and maximize her loyalty and her lifetime value to us as much as possible. So she might have bought a jumper from us 3 years ago. Might send her a prompt to say, are you still wearing that lovely jumper? And if not, maybe have you considered putting it on our resale platform? It's all very easy within our own website. You've already got an account. It's super seamless to do. You're going to generate some credit, which you can then choose to spend as you like, either on secondhand or on firsthand. And the businesses that are doing that really well are seeing that enhanced lifetime value in aggregate. So, and they're driving more profit in aggregate from those customers, as opposed to seeing it as cannibalizing of a first-hand transaction.
So if that is true, then that we're seeing this like higher churn rate through garments, knowing that we can resell them, that companies can also see the value of keeping a customer within the ecosystem, capturing their loyalty as lifetime customers. Does it also require fundamental shifts in how they're designing garments in the first place? And by that, I mean, like, rather than going from this was the trend in 2023, it's like, no, this needs to be functional, not just this year, but next year and the year after, such that when they're trying to resell those things, they still feel relevant and up to date.
So to a degree, I would add though to that in this world of garments having more lifetimes, the pace at which something can go from being brand new on a website to being available on a secondhand platform is quite fast.
Yeah.
So you're not always having to design thinking multiple seasons ahead. Having said that, I think there is a broader trend in the industry towards predicting better what is going to sell to reduce wastage. And that's a brilliant trend that's happening more broadly. And as part of that, businesses are thinking about what we call their kind of fashion pyramid. So you've got all the base stuff that is in your range season to season that doesn't have a kind of shelf life, right up to the top where you've got all the stuff that's really super trend driven, and it might stick or it might not. And that's where you tend to get more wastage. They're thinking very sensitively about the balance across that pyramid to minimize exposure to fads and trends. So that's happening anyway. I think that's probably being accelerated by resale. And then what you are seeing, which the most innovative brands are doing, is really explicit designing for circularity. And there's some brilliant examples. So particularly in kids wear, there's a Swedish brand called Lindex, and they actively say every garment we create is designed to do 3 children.
Wow.
My kids both have coats from Boden. They've got spaces for 3 names in. So this is really explicit designing, knowing that these are going to be either donated or resold. And then I think there's other even more innovative examples. So in the more sort of premium segments, there is a lot of brands who design for refurbishment or alteration. So M&M and the way that they do hems. Ganni have a dedicated design for circularity accreditation on a bunch of their products. And that is so that this is going to work for your body and it's going to work for your body. And we're designing that into the way it's made. So there's lots and lots of innovation happening beyond the ones that we all kind of know and talk about, like Patagonia or North Face, who have been really good on refurbing for quite a while.
I love the idea of the 3 names. I feel like in terms of, okay, on the surface of it, that seems like a very, very small change. But in terms of what it signals to someone of, well, if you just threw it away, you're an idiot.
Yeah, like you're denying this item its next life.
And Abbie, I know I can only speak for us because I know that we went to the same school. At your school, if you got a textbook at the start of the year and you had to write your name in it and your like form, could you also see who had owned that textbook before?
Yeah, in some of them. And some of them you're like flicking back and you're like, oh, 1989. Has the curriculum not changed? Are we still studying Sophie's World in RE? Okay. If that's a very niche reference, I feel, but anybody that went to Cambridge 6th Grammar School in Louth will understand. Yeah, that's so true.
But also, the 6th Grammar School.
There you go. Not in Louth.
Not in Louth, in Southampton.
Did you study Sophie's World or was that lost on you?
I think that was lost on me, unfortunately. I wish it wasn't.
We had an RE teacher called Mr. Poppleton. Sorry, little side note here. Poor Mr. Poppleton, Reverend Poppleton, in fact. And every time he came on stage, the whole school would cough. And I just think that is like so brutal.
It was really brutal.
Poor Reverend Poppleton.
There's no amount of money. No amount of money that you could pay me to become a school teacher. Like, thank goodness there are people that do it. But honestly, that the skin must have to be so thick to withstand some of that.
So thick, yeah.
Oh, and every time, like, I see you've made your point now, everybody. Anyway, but that. Also, to any of my school friends listening, hello. But it is that sort of sense of there is something really beautiful about seeing the ownership, actually, and that not being like a weird obscure thing, but being like, oh my god, this belonged also to another Imogen 3 years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
I actually wish wish that was something that we could see more. I got a gorgeous green velvet dress in a charity shop in Yorkshire just before Christmas, and wore it to the Royal Albert Hall to go watch Guy Barker's Christmas band. But it felt like it had lived a life, you know. And I tagged the charity shop in it, and they commented like, "Oh, Abbie, this is amazing." And I said, "I want to know who brought this in. Do you have any information about this fabulous woman who no doubt lived an amazing life going to cocktail parties in this dress?" They were like, "We'll see what we can do," but they didn't have any information. But that's where this phrase, if you may well have heard if you've been kind of in the sustainable fashion industry, digital product passport is potentially going to change that a little bit, do we think? It's a legislation that's come in the EU. I'm not 110% exactly what it means and what it will do, and it's unfortunately not something that we'll see here in the UK yet. But Liv, have you been looking into that?
Yes, a little bit. And at the moment, it's very much the preserve of the luxury brands. So the way it works, as I understand it, is there's basically two manifestations of it at the moment. You can either buy a garment, and it comes with a companion passport, which is either a physical document or a digital document. And that basically verifies that this was bought where it was bought, from the brand that we believe it was from, with all the manufacturing details behind it, all of the kind of care guidance, and then a kind of unique code that basically says this is the garment that it says it is, which is super important for luxury price point goods. The innovation that's happened more recently is that information can be embedded in a little RFID within the labels themselves of a garment. So from a consumer perspective, that makes that way more seamless. And I think it's Chloe, who's one of the brands, who have been very explicit in saying that they have done that to enable resale. And it's all beautifully synced up with Vestiaire Collective. So you can scan and all of that information is uploaded, and it basically then takes out verification steps that add kind of friction to the process. So I think it's super interesting, but I think at the moment, unless there is a regulatory drive to make that applicable across all price points, it will stay the preserve of the luxury brands rather than the mass brands. Because at the moment, there isn't a great deal of consumer mistrust that the M&S top I buy isn't M&S.
Yeah.
The sort of peer-to-peer level transactions at those price points are pretty trusted.
But that being said, so also something that's in the research that you shared with Abbie and I is that in order to get more people using Vinted, for example, it's not so much about the idea of secondhand fashion, that's pretty well established, but all about reducing those points of friction.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, an M&S t-shirt, in theory, it's very easy to identify it as an M&S t-shirt. But a point of friction on Vinted is inputting that information.
Yes.
And I'd love it if you could scan a label, it all uploads it automatically.
100% that. And that is where, and I think we talked about this last time, but the key to success in these platforms, and the key particularly to driving profit, is that you build everything with your sellers in mind. Your sellers are the ones that build up your brilliant bank of product. They make sure that that's trustworthy, that that's high quality, that's the brand it says it is. And then the buyers come, and then the sellers also become buyers. So it's really self-perpetuating. So the businesses that are doing it best are taking as much friction out for sellers as they possibly can. And at the moment, it's easy-ish to upload a garment to Vinted. It's not complicated, but there are multiple steps. So the next step is going to be that it will become more like a scan the garment, and image recognition will mean that is all the information is entirely populated for you. And in luxury segments, that's a lot of that's already happening. The RealReal, for example, has really sophisticated verification scanning technology, which looks at, like the precise grain of the leather and every single stitch in a handbag, for example, to build confidence in the condition and the trustworthiness of the sort of brand heritage and those things. And you could see that there is a sort of mass market interpretation of that could really reduce the friction for sellers.
Is there also an element then of, if there's far more guarantee in buying, let's say, a luxury item, or even just like a slightly higher price point high street item, if you can buy it secondhand and really, really be sure of what you're getting, but still get it for a lower price point, is there a way of then like, what word am I looking for? Almost transitioning that customer from a secondhand purchaser, having then owned their secondhand thing and loved it for maybe 5 years, into a first-hand customer. And are we seeing that being utilised?
Yes, we are. And one of the key themes actually in the most recent wave of research that we did was that luxury and resale is growing in luxury, but at quite a substantially slower rate than what you're seeing in the mass market. And part of that is that just people don't have as many luxury items. So the sort of liquidity fueling isn't quite there to the same degree. And part of it is that businesses have had to come quite a long way on verification, but they've got there now to a degree. So we're seeing more luxury shift to secondhand. And for many of the best brands, they like it because they see it as customer acquisition. And you're seeing the average age that consumers might start buying into their first beautiful handbag or beautiful pair of shoes from a luxury price point being secondhand. And then what you need to do as a brand is build up a kind of love and connection that means that over time you can be kind of graduated to a first-hand customer. And obviously you've got the benefit very much within those segments and price points of those items keep their value. So a consumer buying into them is thinking about the net cost, not the absolute cost, because they know that there is an inherent resale value. And the other impact that's really fascinating that is becoming more and more prevalent at luxury price points is that you're actually seeing resale drive appreciation, not depreciation. Because scarcity for many brands is a really important part of how they position themselves. And, like the Hermes Birkin bag is the classic example, but there is only a limited run. There's an even more limited run when you look at specific sizes, colors, and finishes. And those bags then, when they're resold, fetch 2 to 2.5 times their first-hand value. And so it's actually brand enhancing rather than brand diminishing for them to be participating in resale.
I mean, you see it sometimes on Vinted where people are like sold out. Like it can be something from Zara, but they're like no longer stock, a jacket that everybody's wearing, and then it's sold out, and they're able, it was on Zara for 80 quid, but they've got it on Vinted for £200 because it's trendy and it's cool and people want to get their hands on it. It's that sort of concept, isn't it? But that's with the high street.
Right, exactly that.
Yeah. And I also find it so annoying because I'm like, I am totally subject to that sort of irrational emotion that it makes you feel. And I'm like, great, I do need that M&S jacket. And am I willing to pay double? I don't know anymore. I've just got to share this with you because I think you're both going to say that I am an absolute moron. But I've just been in Japan, and Japan's secondhand luxury market is like absolutely amazing. Like if I needed a handbag, there was just like limitless choice. But I saw a Birkin bag and it was a pretty reasonable price, which made me think, is this real?
Is it actually real? Yeah.
Yeah. Or actually, are we just seeing the benefit of where the yen currently is? I should have bought it. I could have, I mean, it was bright green. That was the limiting factor. And also, do I have that money? No, but could it have been an investment?
That's the thing. Yeah.
Maybe.
Possibly.
Yeah. You could have flipped the Birkin.
Yeah. Can you imagine? So something I wanted to ask you, because we both are so impressed by this 35% number that is the percentage of the adult population in the UK who are engaged in these secondhand resale platforms. Sounds impressive. But when you look to France, the number's closer, I think, to 47%.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you mentioned earlier is that we're moving as a UK population towards owning fewer, sort of more of a capsule wardrobe approach, something that we recognise as typically very French.
Yeah.
France has also had some super interesting legislation when it comes to fast fashion, how influencers engage with fast fashion, etc., etc. So I wonder if you have any further reflections on why that market is really substantially ahead when it comes to secondhand fashion.
So the anti-fast fashion laws in France have been very, very impactful. They impact how you can describe fast fashion products to a consumer. They impact how you can talk about the price point. They prevent influencers from doing hauls from certain brands that fall below a certain price point. And most importantly, they apply a big tax on fast fashion garments, which is particularly important for the Sheins and Temus of the world. Because if you've bought something for 12 quid and then a £5 tax is put on it, it's actually a really substantial shift in that price point.
Yeah.
So that has had quite a profound impact on consumption behaviours in general in France, and including shift to secondhand. Because why would I not then spend my £12 on something which is much more valuable to me, of a better quality? And then you're absolutely right that more broadly across France, they have been for decades much better at fewer better garments and designing around a capsule wardrobe. And you see that in the data over time, because their market value is not dissimilar to the UK, but their market volume is quite a lot lower. So they are opting in by choice and by culture to higher value items, and they have fewer of them. And then the final factor with France, which has helped accelerate that, is that they were much earlier with the resale trend than we were in the UK. And they applied that to fashion right from the start in a way that we didn't so proactively. And there's a very well established classifieds platform in France called Le Bon Coin.
Le Bon Coin.
And that has been around since 2006. And that was one of the first examples of sort of linking neighbor with neighbor to either buy or donate your old kids' clothes, for example.
But that's amazing, because if we think about 2006 and just reflect on that as a year, a small proportion of people had Facebook. Like, it was, Instagram wasn't a thing, I don't think. Maybe Twitter had just been invented. That whole kind of concept of how you use the internet connecting with like strangers and people was not really a thing. So that's so pioneering.
It's really pioneering. And actually, Le Bon Coin have been very pioneering in general. And they are one of the first peer-to-peer marketplaces in every category to partner with OpenAI so that you can search through their inventory using ChatGPT.
Wow.
And it's a really clever partnership, because you've got all of the benefits that a conversation and the history and the intent and the human language that a search through ChatGPT gives you, but it's then directly interacting with this vast inventory that the kind of classifieds business model facilitates. So it's very clever, and I'm sure we'll see lots of other peer-to-peer platforms following suit.
So I could go on, for example, and say, I am looking for a blue linen shirt from a few of these brands, and it might find people that are selling them and connect me with them through AI.
Exactly that. Yeah. Oh, and you could even be more conversational with it, Abbie. You can say, I want to spend up to £40 on a few different shirts that I could be wearing to work, but also transition to home, that are appropriate for springtime. And it would then do that searching for you.
But like all AI platforms, that is dependent on not just a volume of information, but that information being really high quality. So the images themselves of those garments being top notch, that the information that comes behind that garment as well.
Is correct, yeah.
So if that is the general shift, that there are going to be much more conversational AI platforms, for example, that also provides the motivation for example, RFID tags in clothes, not just to contain the information about that clothing item, but maybe some stock images.
So, and that's, I think, part of the secret sauce of the first-hand brands doing this themselves, because they sit on an absolute treasure trove of information that can do those things and really enhance the customer experience. So they know loads more about you as a customer, what you like, what you've purchased in the past, how regularly, what size you are, what fit you are, what silhouettes work best. They know all of that already. And then they also sit on all the stock images and correct information from those garments going back in history. So I think that's where we're going to see the next wave of growth, because that feels like a much better customer experience than often what you're getting today on Vinted or eBay.
Well, I mean, on Vinted, you're not allowed to upload a photo that has been used on a website. It has to be, supposedly, although I see loads, I don't know how they do it, but I've tried it before and I've been told it off. That was like scolded and told. Yeah, I've been told it off and something has been removed because I used the website photo, which is bizarre because of course it's not going to look the same hanging in my terribly lit spare bedroom when it needs a washing and iron. But yeah, it's an interesting one because, you know, you look at some of the things on Vinted and it just so doesn't look appealing, even though the item is fine.
Yeah, exactly that. It's much more aspirational when you've got the proper stock imagery. And I think Never Fully Dressed do this. Certainly Wise London do this, that they do the stock images and then consumer uploaded images. So then you've got still the confidence and the kind of condition and
in what you're
how well it's
getting,
washed and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I guess that's important, isn't it? I'm curious to know, you know, so you mentioned about the sort of spending habits and the way that us Brits consume fashion compared to the way that the French do, for example. And that 2006 year really stuck with me because I was thinking back, A, 20 years, terrifying, and B, that probably was not a dissimilar time to when I will have placed one of my first ever online orders. And I remember it was on Boohoo for a pair of jeans, and me and my sister were like, even if they're wrong, because like returns and all those kinds of things were a bit scary and we didn't really know what we were doing, they're so cheap that it'll be fine. And they arrived and they were so long. Like I have never seen a pair of trousers so long in my life. And I was like, well, they're mine now. And they were something like £4. So, you know, it's just one of those, well, of course I'm going to just keep them and I'll figure out what to do with the extra 2 meters of jean I have. But
just make 2 sleeves as well.
yeah, just wore a very high boot as a 12-year-old. But it's so interesting that those two things were happening side by side, the UK getting sort of fast fashion online and France getting this amazing, you know, community connecting portal.
Yeah, right.
But do you know what is behind those trends? Like what is leading our British society to live and shop and act in this way, do you think?
I think, well, it's just a real mix of supply driven and demand driven. And what I mean by that is Boohoo existed and made you believe you needed those jeans. And
Yes.
I think we had just the most ridiculous proliferation of fast fashion brands at really, really disposable price points that just dominated during the 2010s. And many of those were really innovative and they have changed the way that we buy fashion. They improved all the interfaces through which we engage. They were the first ones to go on social and allow you to buy through TikTok. You know, there's a lot of great innovation, but it really did drive a culture of consumption and that you would buy a dress for a tenner for your night out and you wouldn't care if you ever wore it again. And that is really unwinding now in all of the kind of broader research we do on the industry, that's just feels a bit distasteful for multiple reasons. Obviously, you know, the environment being a key one, but also just in terms of the way I've chosen to spend my money on what I've chosen to wear to this thing. And that's where we're seeing this shift to sort of fewer better. And that's not to say that it didn't exist in France. Like there are scaled fast fashion retailers in France. I think they've just always exist more counterbalanced with a set of very quality oriented premium brands that, you know, that sort of shift the dial. And then obviously France in general just comes from such a strong chic aesthetic that I think the idea of disposable fashion was probably more distasteful to them earlier than it was in the UK.
But it is like, and I'm fairly convinced we may have mentioned this when we had the podcast last year as well. Like one thing that I always think about is there's one former Love Island contestant. She was a pioneer on OnlyFans, I believe, at the time. And she got really criticised for promoting super, super fast fashion, you know, the kind of brands where you can get things like a top for £1 and that sort of stuff. And she was like, criticise me all you like, but look at the demographic of my audience. They do not have disposable income. Why should they not be able to follow the latest fashions and to wear clothes that they feel fantastic in? So there is this sort of element of like, whilst this is fundamentally a good thing, fewer better, that is better for everyone and for brands, that the shift to secondhand, also amazing. I think in the back of my mind, I'm also like, I don't want to sound like a snob when I criticize fast fashion because there are people who do depend on it. And I suppose it's the price point is a problem, the working conditions is a problem, the volume is maybe the biggest problem. And I wonder how, when you look across the retail sector, you kind of square that particular hole.
Oh gosh, yeah.
It's quite a navel-gazing question.
Where to begin? So I think one of the key reasons why resale, and particularly Vinted, have been such a disruptive force is that they have democratized access to slightly better brands. And that is a phenomenal shift. And I think particularly if you are a parent, for example, and so your budget every month has to stretch for you and for your kids and maybe also for your partner. And suddenly I have a place where not only can I do that, but I can also make some money on the side by selling the stuff we're not currently wearing. And so I think that's a wonderful democratizing force that we have seen. But yes, more broadly, we have to have a fashion industry that caters to every price point. And, you know, some of the most fashionable people out there aren't fashionable because they have buckets of money. They're fashionable because they have an amazing eye. They have an amazing, you know, they have really good understanding of colors and cuts and patterns and silhouettes and all of those things. And so who is the industry would be bonkers, but also really up its own arse to prevent them from accessing that. So you've got to play to different price points, but I think the channels through which you do that are really shifting.
I just want to share this little story about our Auntie Wendy, who is exactly who I thought of in this moment of time. So Auntie Wendy lives in Gibraltar. She has been in Gibraltar for many decades because she was on her way to see Bob Marley and ran out of money and got stuck in Gibraltar. Gibraltar doesn't have loads of charity shops. So whenever she came to Southampton to visit us, she would spend a whole day going through Portswood High Street charity shops. We would go past and not really find any gems. She would, after this day, come out with just the most extraordinary things.
Yeah.
And I love that recently, bearing in mind she's now in her 60s, she went to Manchester, and the Manchester School of Fashion were interviewing people in the street that they deemed really trendy. She got stopped. She got interviewed. She was like, oh, well, here are all my charity shop items. They're like, who is your fashion inspiration? She was like, oh, I don't flipping know. She said Vivienne Westwood.
Oh, excellent answer.
Yeah. But yeah, you're so right. Like fashion taste and fashion and how it's worn are all slightly different things.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think with what's a shame is that you are right, like price points, everybody being able to afford to buy clothes for their family goes without saying, so important. And I remember like when I was little doing a food shop with mum, and like I think the supermarkets had just started to do a few items of clothing, and the big Asda in Grimsby was a really good one for me to get like a few bits of clothing. And so it used to be that, you know, alongside our Warburton's bread, I would sometimes come away with, you know, a new top from Asda. And I think the whole supermarkets transitioning into fashion has been a really interesting one, because they probably started out very much feeling like they were targeting that market, and rightly so. But what has unfortunately happened is that naturally they've wanted to make more money, and it's a little bit of greed. And it's also then a case of, you know, if they've started working with better designers and those clothes have become much more trendy, and then the fact that it's a lower price point isn't just appealing to the people who perhaps earn less money or have less money, it's also appealing to the people who have a decent amount of money and can therefore afford to buy 10 of those things. So it's this like frustrating situation where everybody probably set out with really good intentions. I think not dissimilarly with Klarna, where, you know, the quality, the whole like buy cheap, buy twice, I genuinely do believe in. But again, that's very difficult when people are living hand to mouth every month and they can't afford to spend £80 on a pair of shoes, even though they will last them 10 years, and they actually can only afford to spend £9 on a pair of shoes. The concept of Klarna in that situation is fabulous, because they can afford to spread those payments out over 12 months or whatever to buy something that's actually going to see them through and actually going to last them. But that's not what it's doing. It's actually just encouraging people to buy far more. Instead of buying the one pair of shoes, people are going to buy the 10 pairs of shoes and have them all, you know, those payments coming out over a longer period of time. So I think it's just a case of like a handful of people that are unfortunately abusing those situations, and then the companies that are kind of playing into it, which has led to this mess of a situation that the UK fashion market has found itself in.
But I think it's also, it's really interesting because what we're kind of, you and I are both going like, oh God, is capitalism. And actually that we live in a society where we need to drive profit, and to drive profit, we need to encourage people to buy things. But I think what's been fascinating hearing about the various different models or avenues that are being explored by some of the brands you're working with is that actually there is this subtle shift that is happening of this is not necessarily about volume of new transactions, but squeezing more value out of the lifetime of a single item.
Yes, exactly that. And then I think, just as you were making that point, Abbie, which I think is such a good one, but one of the things that has been so important to Resale growing, and in so doing democratizing access to fashion at a broader range of price points. So at the heart of that has been, we need to build models that can make money. The path to profitability has been really important because they obviously allow the businesses themselves to self-sustain, but perhaps even more importantly, they also then attract external investment into those businesses, which means they can invest behind AI and better tech to make the experience better for all of us. They can expand into other markets that they might not be able to access ordinarily, so that helps democratize further. It allows them to stretch into other categories that mean we have more ways to resell across more things we have in our homes. So becoming profitable has been really important here. But I get what you don't want is that the pursuit of profit means that you're transforming an industry in a way that's actually destructive rather than additive. But my sense is that the path to profit in resale has been a positive wave of change.
And that's really exciting. And that's a classic case of what I always say to people: we have the power as consumers to drive entire industry change. And it's that, I hear it all the time, oh, but one little thing isn't going to make a difference. It's not going to make a difference if I don't buy that, or if I do buy this, or if I consume in that way. It fundamentally does, because if it's a mass movement, look at what has to happen, look at what is happening. And what are you kind of predicting for the future, that it's just going to continue to rise?
So it's a really good question, and one we get asked a lot by both the first-hand brands that we work with, because obviously it's impacting their volumes, but also the investors that we work with who are looking for a piece of the action. So we sized the online secondhand fashion market in the UK, France, Poland, and the US as 34 billion today, which is massive. In the UK, it's about 5 billion. And to put that into context, that means the same amount of money is spent on online secondhand fashion as coffee. By which I mean coffee that you get from a coffee shop, not coffee that you buy in a supermarket. But that is a huge market.
Yeah.
I think it's very easy to say it's 5 billion. It's that means we are spending about as much as we spend on coffee as we are on online secondhand fashion, which is huge. When you look at all the stats, it's been growing every year. It's been growing both in number of users, buyers and sellers, but also in the amount they spend every year, which is largely down to frequency. So they're going on to transact more often. We think there's headroom across both of those things, but it's likely to slow down a little bit. High growth markets can't sustain ridiculous high growth, but there is still a load of headroom to go after. And if you look at vintage usage across its core markets, it's still quite a lot behind Amazon. It's still quite a lot behind Allegro. It's still quite behind eBay in certain markets. So we know that there is more users that can be joining these platforms. And then we definitely know that there can be more frequency of use. And we also know that there can be a stronger overlap between sellers and buyers. So how can the people who just buy today also become sellers? And that helps drive growth. And then the other thing, which we haven't sized, but is another huge upside here, is extension into other categories. So basically anything that you have in some kind of abundance in your home that can be put into a bag and posted, there's absolutely no reason why that can't reach an equivalent scale to fashion, right? So small home items, baby goods, consumer electronics, they all have resale markets, but they're way less mature than fashion. So there's a lot of growth that can be going there. And so if you sort of run the maths of that, We think online secondhand fashion can get to about 50 billion by 2030
Wow.
across
50
the US,
billion?
Poland, which will be about 13% of total apparel spend in those markets. So a huge,
But also,
really,
would that then bring down first-hand sales, do you think, as well? So would you see the scales kind of balancing themselves out a bit more, do you think?
I think so, yes. I think most of that will be felt through volume, though, rather than value, because there's going to be a bit of inflation and price increase. And as we said, the sort of trend to trading up and fewer better will mean that there's a bit of price growth across the industry more broadly. But I think those volumes will be flat. So yes, you're going to see that mix effect continue to shift.
So then if we look at, like, with any big transition, we have to consider that there are people who are good at innovating and being ahead of this trend, and there will inevitably be some losers in this game as well. You've mentioned very clearly that I think there's huge scope of opportunity for capturing value, particularly with luxury brands. Who are the kind of people that you're a little bit worried about? And you don't need to name specific brands, but maybe sectors that you're like, okay, you need to kind of innovate in what you're doing a little bit more strategically.
I think there's a price point that is a bit more tricky to reliably resell. And so those brands that really fall into value price points, you're still seeing quite a lot of volume of that stuff on Vinted, but it tends to take longer to shift. And it's not quite so popular with buyers. So I think that's a bit of a harder place to play. And then I think because resale has changed trade up and trade down dynamics, and the brands that you identify with and you want to buy, it's quite hard playing in premium price points at full price, because there is nearly always a secondhand alternative that feels in absolute terms quite a lot cheaper. So I think we're going to see a lot more innovation from the segment of brands that sort of sit above a Next or M&S to really try and develop really meaningful resale capabilities. I'm sure that's going to happen next. And then I don't know about explicit losers, because I think, as with any disruptive force, over time they tend to benefit an industry. And if you think about the fact, when to Abbie's earlier example, when online shopping was invented in fashion, initially all of the traditional retailers were like, oh my God, this is going to ruin us. No one wants to shop with us anymore. And actually what happened is they firstly developed those capabilities to participate. And then they also realized that there was really comfortable coexistence of online and offline channels. And I think you could see something similar happening in resale, where it reaches more of a sort of steady state, where for certain needs, price points, occasions, categories, you tend to opt for resale, and in other ones you tend to opt for firsthand.
God, this has been so fascinating. And what is really frustrating is that we have reached 53 minutes, and I feel like we could go for another 53 minutes. But I think a key take home that I feel I've extracted from this is that we are genuinely shifting to a world of fewer and better. And that is an incredibly good thing for the fashion industry, but it is also something we need to see replicated in other industries as well, and for value to be seen not in volume of transactions, but ongoing lifetime value as well. And me and Abbie, we can continue to rake in that Vinted credit with some confidence.
I challenge anybody to, I raise you what my current Vinted account is at. And this is only off the back of about 2 to 3 weeks worth of hardcore going at it. Currently at £278.17 in my Vinted account. I know.
Wow.
And I've got pending another 200 because I posted a load of items over the last few days. So the guy at the post office said to me the other day, he's Scottish and I'm going to really butcher his accent. Have you got any clothes left? And he said on one of them, because I was posting so many, I had to write on the packages what they were. And on one, I was sending 2 items, and I'd put pink zebra and then something else underneath it. And he went, pink zebra dress, the mind boggles. It was 2 items.
So we're going to finish with the question that we ask. We try to ask most guests. Sometimes we get excited and forget. But what is the last thing that you did with the planet in mind?
to say this is such an oxymoron, what I'm about to say. Is that okay?
Well, if you're going to say I burnt a tyre, then probably keep it to yourself. But if it's acceptable, do continue.
Oh, I don't know if you would count it as acceptable. So my answer is renting ski wear.
I see where we're going.
Yeah.
Because obviously you wear your ski wear once a year. There is absolutely no need to buy that. By Rotation has a really amazing range of designer ski wear, which is fantastic. But obviously it's to wear on a ski holiday, which maybe we just have to, the less said about that, the better.
Do you know what's brilliant? That is the perfect way to summarise the fact we are the perfect podcast for imperfect environmentalists. You are an imperfect environmentalist and we love you for it.
And also, I really did think you were going to say something incredibly boring, because I know that your husband, Mike, he's very good at making sustainable swaps in your household. So you have all of like sustainable toilet paper, washing powder, like all that kind of stuff.
We do, yeah.
I was like, it's going to be something like that, which, no shade on it, very good. But no, at least this one had a little bit of sass and excitement.
A little bit of sass and excitement, exactly. And all in pursuit of like a very beautiful ski suit.
I look forward to seeing the photos.
Oh, for sure.
Well, that is sadly all that we have time for. But thank you so much for, coming to my house. We discovered that we haven't seen each other yet in person this year, which never happens.
This is like unprecedented length of time without seeing
No,
each other.
I beg to differ. Green Queen's 1 year anniversary party.
Oh, you're absolutely
Liars.
right. You're complete. We knew there was something and we just couldn't remember it. Yeah, you're right.
Like, I was there.
Just ignore that completely.
Yeah. So we saw each other a month ago, but it felt like 10 years.
It felt like forever.
Yeah. So we end this podcast with a lie.
Well, it's nice to see you again this year. And thank you so much for joining us. This has been really fascinating. And no doubt you will need to come on next year when we're inching ever closer to that $50 billion market valuation.
So exciting.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Green Queens.
If you did and you'd like to hear more, we'd be so very grateful if you could like,
subscribe, and join the Green Group Chat for weekly episodes.